Well, for more on social media and revolutions, I'm joined by Mokhtar Awad. He's a research fellow for George Washington University's Extremism program. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
So, as we look at the developments since 2011, how has life changed for Egyptians?
For some people, it actually got a bit worse. In the immediate years after the 2011 revolution, there was great deficiencies in normal security for individuals. And this was something new and different for Egyptians. And so a lot of people had to struggle with that. Also, on the economic front, the country, almost half of its reserves were depleted. And there was no economic growth that we can compare to the years previous. Really, on all levels, things did not improve by almost any metric that we can use. But people remain largely hopeful, but in a way want to make sure things go back to some level of normalcy, which is why we see some support for this regime, even though there are lots of drawbacks. People at least want that stability to ground them and to at least hopefully put them on the correct path.
Now, you mentioned stability, and obviously when you do have one of these uprisings, they're very engaged, they're very excited, and then we start looking at the aftermath. But when you look at some of these grassroots movements, how has technology and social media changed the landscape, especially since the Arab Spring?
Well, the thing about the use of technology is that it was kind of there's a mixed blessing there. So initially, the innovation helped make sure a hodgepodge of activists from all sorts of different ideological strands are able to organize in a way that the government couldn't keep tab on, and also help inspire people to go out in the street. The problem is that they lived in their own bubble and continue to do so. The level of internet penetration is there in countries like Egypt. However, the political culture that many of these activists subscribe to didn't necessarily go beyond them and didn't reach people. And so we saw a reflex, especially in Egypt, not that many years after the revolution, almost in the second year, if not the same year, where middle-class people, some older people, began to look at these activists just simply in the virtual world with no connection to reality. This is a continued struggle for these activists, not only in Egypt, but also in Tunisia and other parts of the Arab world, who need to make actually the jump from the virtual world to the real world.
Now, you mentioned some of the drawbacks. And what about things like potential dangers, like trying to decipher misinformation? A lot of times in the excitement, there's a lot of information out there, deciphering fact from fiction, also perhaps the use of the same systems by extremists. Tell us about some of the potential dangers, you think.
Well, in a way, it's also like how democracy works. You have a lot of freedom, you have a lot of information, and it really depends on what you decide to do with it. The internet technology, as bad as some of the uses we see with groups like ISIS and so on, at the same time, we cannot ignore the fact that they allowed people in the first place, even those who ironically opposed the revolutionaries, took to some of these social media platforms to voice their opposition. So we see that in the overall, it's a fact of life that we have to live with. But again, as the dangers we see with governing systems like democracy, with the internet, with the democratization of knowledge and access to knowledge, we will have these issues that deal with what can we do to make sure these systems are not used by criminals, by terrorists, but at the same time not use that as an excuse to curb regular people's ability to access the internet.
Now, when it comes to actually keeping that contact with regular people, as you're saying, how can leaders perhaps use this technology to better engage with citizens so that perhaps they can address their needs before there's an uprising?
Well, there are attempts to use new technology, social media to some extent. So, for instance, subsidies are a major thing in the Arab world, a major hurdle for economic growth. And there's usually a desire for a shift towards cash payments to citizens. Of course, that requires the use of technology and having citizens have a basic level of technical literacy to be able to use ATM machines and things along those lines. And so governments can, when they're executing these reform programs, hopefully, they can rely on the internet to make sure that whatever the reform vision is directly going to the citizen, and the citizen at the same time can fully access what his or her rights are, what his or her, the services that they're provided to them are, in a way, it makes government's work easier. And if technology is used to its full extent, can actually begin to bridge some of the gaps that do exist due to issues relating to legitimacy, deficiencies in how institutions work, the gap that exists between the ruled and the ruler in the Middle East. And that would go a long way in stabilizing this region.
And Mokhtar, as we look at this borderless digital movement, we're seeing that people can now go online and literally share a revolution. And we mentioned the long-term impact. So when you look at the outlook for Egypt and these other countries who saw these uprisings, what does that look like for you?
Well, it's a transition period. As tired as this may sound, it is still the problem is that we assumed that these types of transitions, because we live in the 21st century, can take a fraction of the time that it took for other countries and other civilizations. But in reality, this is a decades-long process, especially in the Arab world. And we're only 5 years into it. A decade hasn't even passed. So people are learning from their mistakes. Governments are learning from their mistakes. And there will be lots of obstacles in the future. Not to sound too cliche, but especially in the Middle East, it will definitely get worse before it can get any better. So.
Well, definitely something we'll be keeping an eye on. Thank you so much for joining us, Mokhtar Awad from George Washington University.
Thank you.